Hey, everybody, it's Pastor Ty from the Kindred Church of Kansas City. I hope you're all enjoying a great summer. It is August 13th, a Thursday, and we have concluded our first summer series on select Psalms, and we are moving into our final series of 2026. We are going to go verse by verse through the book of James, and this afternoon is our sermon series preview, and the title of this sermon series is going to be Living Faith, an exploration through the book of James. And the title, like you would expect any sermon series title to be, is very intentional. And the reason why it's called Living Faith is because faith is one of the most repeated words throughout the book of James, which is interesting because many people's first conclusion of James isn't to think of faith, but to think of other things. But in reality, it's like the main topic of the book. And so Living Faith is the overall title of the series. And there are two things that are going to happen from James 1 into James chapter 5. And that is this notion that faith is central to the Christian religion. And there are two elements that make up a living faith. On one hand, there is this active component to living faith. That is, a living faith will bear certain things, certain fruits. And so throughout the 20 weeks we're going to cover in the book of James, you're going to see several examples of faith enacted, faith that is instructed by James, that is highly practical. If you are looking for a book that doesn't get lost in concept and nuance, James is for you. It's deeply instructive. It's intended for the Christian, and it's effectively a 5-chapter rundown of, if your faith is placed in Christ, this is the expectation. It's very instructive. It's very practical. And there are many examples of active proxies for the Christian to showcase their faith publicly and to their neighbors and to their peers. But on the other hand, there's also this passive element to a living faith. There are, throughout James's book, several proxies and examples of ways in which the Christian bridles or harnesses or abstains that also conveys a living faith. And so as much as it's, here are the active, practical things that are expected to be born out of one who professes faith, there's also this component of, and here's the restraint that you ought to exhibit as one who possesses faith in the resurrected Christ. Now, that's just a very quick rundown of the title and the overarching banner theme of the series that we're going to be covering from now until the end of December. I want to very quickly do two more things during this review video, or this preview video. The first one is I want us to become sensitive and focused on 5 key things that keep popping up as I have studied through the book of James. And then I want us to very quickly look through James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, which will be this Sunday's primary text. So first, the 5 things that I believe anybody that's going to do a good faith run through the book of James ought to be looking for. The first thing is I want people that are reading through the book of James in this series to notice all the examples of language that speaks to the inverted nature of the Christian faith. And so the idea here is every time something seems upside down or the opposite of what you'd expect, James is doing this very intentionally. And so throughout the language of James, I want the reader to look for areas where something is inverted. Well, the practical wisdom would suggest this. James suggests the inverted reality. That appears throughout all 5 chapters of James. And you'll see it very quickly in James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. The other thing you're going to note, and this is subtly different than inverted language, but there's also throughout the book of James a lot of contrast language. And so the idea here is James contrasts competing elements a lot in this book. So as we're covering James, we're going to want to pay attention and be really sensitive to all the times James contrasts one thing with something else. So a lot of contrast language in James. He gives a lot of proxies that go in differing directions because, again, it's highly instructive, very practical, aimed at being materially useful to the Christian life. Number 3, you're going to notice, and this shouldn't surprise anyone because James' heritage is that of the Jewish faith, but there is a lot of purity language in James. A lot of language that comes out of a sacrificial system context. You're going to see this throughout James's book. It's very clear that he's coming out of a heritage, out of a context where there was a lot of sacrificial elements and a lot of purity standards and expectations. And James leans on that and utilizes it throughout the book. And that necessarily gets us to the 4th theme that you're going to find throughout this series over the next 20 weeks. And it's directly related to the one I just shared. Due to the fact that there's a lot of purification language and a lot of cleanliness sensitivity and a lot of evidence of a sacrificial system upbringing, you're also going to notice diaspora language. And what I mean by that is there is this understanding that James is writing to a body of people who have been scattered, who have been forcefully moved out into various regions. We're going to talk a lot about this on Sunday when we get into the very beginning of the series. But this notion of diaspora language, this notion that James is writing this letter to people that have been moved in every direction on purpose with intent. And the reasoning behind that dispersion is really important. And this, I believe, is one of the most fundamental clues to properly understanding James and having deep peace as you read through it. Because a lot of people struggle with James. I know that won't be a shock to a lot of you. But there are a lot of verses in James who are like, wait, what? Like, are we sure? Like, oh, this is why people argue about various elements of faith. But what I'm here to tell you is that if you pick up that clue of dispersion language that comes at the very onset of James and sort of persists throughout, I think it speaks to some of the direct tensions that are found throughout this letter. And so recognizing that James is writing to a dispersion and is using language that an entire group of people have in their history will help explain a lot of what James is really gearing at, and I believe harmonizes well with the rest of the New Testament canon. So lots of inverted language where James is intentionally flipping things on its head. A lot of contrast language where James is very clearly presenting this and presenting that in opposition to one another. A lot of purity language that would have come out of a sacrificial heritage, and a lot of language to the dispersion, which would have had its own history and context for those who were formerly Jewish. And last but not least, and this is, again, something we will talk about both on Sunday and literally throughout the series, is there is so much evidence in the book of James of Jesus's words being captured by James. When you're reading through James, I believe it is impossible to read it and not see all the examples where you're like, Jesus said that. Like, he had to have been nearby Jesus's ministry and picked that up from him. And as a result, it makes its way into James. In fact, James was most likely written prior to at least all of the Gospels, some of them at least, if not all of them. And so you get this impression that a lot of the things you later read in the Gospels first was captured by James and then later preserved and shared once more, retransmitted again in the Gospels. And so those 5 themes you're going to see throughout the book of James. A lot of inverted language, a lot of contrasts, a lot of purity language, a lot of language written to the dispersion, which again was loaded. It would have been seen in 2 different ways. And then finally, clear evidence that James walked near to Jesus. Why does all this matter? All of this matters because in order to really understand what James is teaching throughout this letter, you have to pick up those 5 things. So I want us all to be sensitive to those 5 themes as we begin this series in the book of James. Now, very quickly, and I do mean quickly, I want us to set the series up by recognizing that James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is what we're covering on Sunday. I'm going to read these 4 verses and then just share some very brief thoughts ahead of Sunday's sermon that will kick off the series. So here's James 1, 1 through 4. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. So I'm not going to belabor these verses and the content therein. That is for Sunday. But just a couple things right off the jump. I want you to notice that James has a unique initial welcome to his letter. His first greeting is different than Paul, is different than John's, different than Peter. So he's got a unique way of introducing himself in the letter, in contrast to them. I want you to notice that he pretty much gets right to the point in verse 2. He has his first of many exhortations. It's the first example of inverse language where you're like, hang on a second, what's going on here? Because I wouldn't expect to have that result from this occurrence. And yet he presents it unblinkingly and soberly. And last but not least, I want you to notice the very high aspirational language that James hits you with from the jump. James isn't joking when he leads off this letter of his with a very high bar for the Christian. He recognizes the hurdles and the difficulties of the Christian life and the forces that are at play against the Christian, and yet he doesn't excuse a Christian from living a life that is vibrant and faithful. Hence the name of the series, Living Faith. The last thing I would throw out here is that from the jump, you notice that James has a very clear and healthy understanding of salvation and also of sanctification. And he assumes salvation at the beginning of the letter and immediately dives into evidence of sanctification. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that on Sunday. But James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is where we're going to begin. We've got lots to cover in there, and we'll have a lot more over the next corresponding 19 weeks as we use the rest of 2026 to understand better this fantastic book that was written by James. And so anyway, God bless you. I'm very excited to see so many of you on Sunday as we embark on a new book study. Until then, God bless you. I'll see you soon.